when I asked you to think to what you might consider a Paralympic athlete to be and what might limit their performance, what comes to many people's minds is paralysis. And of course you'd be right. One of the main factors that influences how well someone can perform is their level of injury. And so I first want to start by sharing two cases with you. Here we have Tom Agar. He was the British #1 rower and world champion until just in London last year. I think you'll all agree from looking at the size of his biceps, which are about the size of my legs, that he has very good muscle function remaining. His level of spinal cord injury is low down in the spinal cord, and so you'll also notice he has good trunk function, is able to sit upright in his chair. Contrast this now to Andy Barrow, captain of the Great Britain wheelchair rugby squad. In contrast, he has an injury very high up in his spinal cord. So we're talking up here in the neck. He has not such good muscle definition. He needs to wear a strap around his abdomen to stop him falling forward. Yet he's still able to compete in one of the most violent sports, wheelchair rugby. But what about outside of paralysis? What about cardiovascular function? So we know the heart and the arteries are critical to improving sports performance and to exercise. If we're able to increase heart rate and blood pressure, we can deliver more oxygen to the working muscles, effectively allowing us to exercise longer and harder. What about people with spinal cord injury where perhaps they can't increase their heart rate so well, can't increase their blood pressure? Maybe the cardiovascular system might limit them from performing at the top of their ability. And so one really important thing to note here is that the level and motor ability doesn't necessarily predict how well the heart and the cardiovascular system might function. So you can have someone that has very good motor ability after spinal cord injury, but actually the control of their heart isn't so good. Alternatively, you can have someone that has very good control of their heart, but yet they exhibit a large amount of paralysis. And that's because the systems that control our muscles is different to the systems that control our heart and cardiovascular system. So our heart and cardiovascular system is controlled by something we call the autonomic nervous system. Think of this as our automatic system. It takes care of everything for you. It helps to speed things up, it helps to slow things down. It regulates things like digestion, breathing, and the heart. For those interested, it looks a little like this. It gives us all a headache. For those of you that are unable to see the heart in there, it's located somewhere in the middle. Now I'm going to leave this up for a minute. There's going to be a test at the end of the session, so please look carefully. It's that joke, I'm sorry. Okay, and so if we really want to look at the cardiovascular system and see whether it might limit performance and exercise, well then we need to measure the cardiovascular system during exercise. Now there's a few different ways that we can do this. Typically, it's been done using an arm crank ergometer. We can also use their sports wheelchairs, put them on a roller and measure physiological responses during wheelchair ergometry. More recently, they've developed treadmills that are nearly 2 meters wide that now allow us to put these sports wheelchairs on a treadmill in the lab, and we can actually take a really good look in depth at what's going on with the cardiovascular system. Alternatively, as I'm sure many of you have done as well, we can simply use a heart rate strap, put it around the chest, and we can actually measure them out whilst they're performing during games and whilst they're performing during training. And so I want to share with you now a story of a few different athletes where we did exactly that. So what you're looking at here on this rather messy trace, you'll see lots of different individual colours. These different individual colours represent a set individual athletes. Up here we have heart rate. So the higher up on here, the higher the heart rate. Across we have time. Now we got them just to do some simple warm-up exercises, and then we asked them to push as hard as they could for 40 minutes. And we were simply measuring the heart rate response during that 40-minute period. Now, if an able-bodied individual was to do this, we might expect to see a response something like this. A heart rate would go up very quickly, and then be generally maintained throughout that 40 minutes. What we see in spinal cord injury is a complete diversity of response. Now, of course, this might just be due to the different levels of injury. But in fact, all of these individuals on this graph have exactly the same level of injury. These are all C6 to C7 individuals. Yet we have 3 distinct responses. We have those that can increase heart rate almost to the same level, those that have some increase in heart rate, and alternatively, those that really can't increase heart rate at all. And so, for all of these athletes that play the same sport with the same level, clearly cardiovascular function and how much they have remaining is different. Now, a lot of you out there might be saying, well, who cares? Who cares that cardiovascular function is different? Is it really important for exercise? And well, the way that we look at this is by taking some kind of performance test and looking to see whether those that can have higher heart rates and better cardiovascular function are able to perform better in that test. And so this is a simple 4-minute push test. It's used as a key performance indicator in wheelchair rugby. Generally, the further that people are able to push in 4 minutes, the better their endurance performance and the better they're able to compete. And now if heart rate was to be important, we might expect to see a relationship like this, where the higher the heart rate, the further they're able to push in the 4 minutes. And in fact, when we do that, that's exactly what we see. So those dots are individual athletes, again, all with the same level of injury, and yet some can push as little as 700 meters, others can push as high as 800 meters. And we actually find one of the best predictors of that is how much of their cardiovascular system they have remaining. And so, now this would all be, of course, okay if the current classification system adequately accounted for cardiovascular function. Now, for those of you that are unaware, classification is a very difficult process. It's been evolving for the last 10 years, and it differs vastly by sport. If we take wheelchair rugby, which is the sport where most of this data is generated in, classification is generally made up of 3 different parts. We do what we call bench testing, where we're testing the strength and flexibility of different muscle groups. They're then assessed for ball handling skills, and then they're observed during match play. And so when we then looked at how their cardiovascular function relates to their classification, instead of finding a nice relationship, we actually find big differences. And so classification now across here goes up in 0.5 increments, with 3.5. Higher the classification, in theory, the better the function. Yeah, I hope you can see here we have 2 athletes with a 2 classification, yet their maximum heart rate response delivers differences by nearly 50 beats per minute. A huge difference. And so at least it appears the cardiovascular system is important for performance in wheelchair rugby. And so fast forward to London 2012. Unfortunately, it's unrealistic to expect every Paralympic athlete to go through a maximal exercise test just before they compete. So instead, what we were looking at is some other measure of cardiovascular function. And so here we're using blood pressure, which would be expected to respond very similar to heart rate. And we're doing a simple test, one that's been slightly spoken about by Dr. Krassioukov before, where we're looking at blood pressure whilst they're laying down. So blood pressure is being measured by a finger cuff and also on the arm here. And then we simply get that person to sit up, or we sit them up while supporting them, and we're simply calculating the change in blood pressure. And this gives us a very good idea of how well the cardiovascular system is performing. And so now I want to share with you the story of 3 different athletes. These 3 athletes have exactly the same sports classification. They have exactly the same level of injury. And what we got them to do is we measured blood pressure laying down. We then asked them to sit up and just maintain that seated position for 8 minutes. And so this is the response we saw in the first athlete. This would be typical to what an able-bodied individual would experience. Blood pressure is able to increase slightly and then be maintained as you sit up. This is a very important adjustment to sitting up. I'm sure everybody in this room has felt it at some times. Either you get out of bed too quickly in the mornings, you feel lightheaded. If blood pressure was to drop here, this is what we experience: fainting, dizziness, lightheadedness. So this one athlete was able to cope very well. Next, we have an athlete where blood pressure drops and is then able to be maintained. In one athlete, after only 3 minutes of the test, we had to terminate the test early because they had such severe symptoms and they were almost to the point of fainting. So again, remember, these athletes, same level of injury, same classification within their respective sport. And so we then took this and looked at it amongst all of our athletes that we tested, and we compared we compared their cardiovascular responses against their classification. So again, just to remind you, the lower the classification, you'd expect a greater drop in blood pressure, i.e. worse cardiovascular function. Higher the classification, in theory, the better the cardiovascular function. This is what we saw. So if anyone can find a good relationship in there, please let me know afterwards. Because to me, as I hope you can see, we have huge variation amongst athletes of similar levels of injury and similar classifications. Take this 2-point category, for example. Some individuals, no drop in blood pressure whatsoever. Others have a drop of nearly 60 millimeters of mercury. So huge variation in the ability to control their cardiovascular system. Remember, how well they're able to control the cardiovascular system gives us a good idea of how we can perform during exercise. And so, well, what can we do? Well, part of what we hope this research will do is to be able to work with the International Paralympic Committee, work with governing bodies for the respective sports, and maybe help to work with them to look at the classification system in a bit more detail. And maybe in the future we can start to account for some of this